Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much for this very friendly introduction and for leading me into this talk. It is indeed the case that I've been working in the area of Russian avant-garde for a long time. I keep returning to it and to the question of what it all has to do with today's world. And I'm pleased that you're asking this question here as well. Though working on the assumption of Germany's Bauhaus movement, I've been asked to talk about new man in Russian avant-garde, and I'm happy to do this using the example of this type of art, this very diverse movement, because I think it was the most consistent approach to shape the new man. It's going to get a bit dry, but it won't be too theoretical. I'll be giving you some examples from art and scientific application, because I think what's important is not just to talk about the utopias of avant-garde artists, but also to talk about their attempts to implement these utopias. And much of what was developed in the Bauhaus was either brought by Russians, such as Vasily Kandinsky, or taken it from Bauhaus to Russia with Hannes Meyer, who worked directly with the architects that I will be introducing you to now or presenting. So that perhaps one can say that the utopias that we heard about yesterday, whether it's experiments or transparency, to a certain extent were actually implemented in Russia. Russian avant-garde is something that we all are familiar with as the art of the vanguard. Its most famous photographer, Alexander Rodchenko, announced at the beginning of the 20s, man is an experiment for the future, and he encapsulated the concept of progress that later came to the capitalist West. Unlike the West, the avant-garde art found itself in the unusual situation of being involved after the October Revolution in Russia in the great project of building up socialist society, and thus made the movement something it could never have been anywhere else in the world, i.e. creating new man. If the 19th century brought forth the physiological and psychological research of bodies, the standardization of behavior and child-rearing methods as well. In the early 20s, it was more than just sort of achieving standardization. It was about increasing human capacity, better reflexes, stronger perception, and an ability to work harder, all things that we still strive for today. And nearly all professions of the new society were involved in this optimization. At the end of the day, it wasn't just about propagating new man, but creating new man, which was a paradox situation in a way. The optimizations for which Russian workers were supposed to work towards, they didn't even know. And therefore, this optimization had to be designed by the artists, even though it was going to happen in the future, and then be shown to them. Thus, we had photographers, photographs, buildings, films, and posters that showed you how to leap into the future. The artists used practices that were commonly used in science. People were measured like maps, photographs, used collages of events and people, and brought together a sort of man-machine merge. Films tried to manipulate the perception people had through editing. At the same time, in the young Soviet Union, design was carried out through application-oriented disciplines in a programmatic way. Pavlov's reflex theory is the basis of pedagogics, work sciences, ergonomics as an area of physiology and psychology, and then eugenics as an area of genetics. And all of these basically engaged with the question of how environment and organism influenced one another, and how, through the help of a change in the environment, you could change people. I'm going to just give you a couple of key examples of such processes and make it clear just how much this experimenting with human capacities was not something that was only of interest to artists, but was also something you found in sort of humanities and science generally. And this is important, I think, this connection, because it prepares the situation that we have now, that we link with the wild times of the 20s. And I'll happily discuss all of this with you afterwards. So what you can see here is the entrance to the Lubyanka metro station. It looks like a camera lens that's looking out of the ground to the empty square in front of it in the building opposite, the former KGB building, which is still where the security services are today. The reference to the most modern technological surveillance media of film in the 20s tells us what this architecture is about, controlling the movements of the inhabitants of these cities. And where is this more important than in the underground, where you have to get lots of people to come from A to B? And the aim of this was optimizing motion in public spaces. All of the farmers and illiterates who came into the major cities in their hundreds and could hardly read required not letters, but rather forms and shapes and colors that showed them how to go through Moscow's streets. And it was basically up to buildings to look at how they could help such smooth movements happen. The architect who used such apparatuses with his buildings and factored in applied psychology was called Nikolai Ladovsky. He taught at WuChu with constructivists such as Lisitsky and Alexander Rodchenko. And he was also a guest or host of Le Corbusier and Hannes Meyer. He didn't come up with these apparatuses. They had been constructed based on German role models from psychotechnology and were therefore tested by these architects and later trained. So if you get exposed to something like this when you're studying architecture, watch out. These tests tried to measure the assessment of volume, spatial depth, angle ratios, and surface sizes, and this was regularly repeated. The response times were measured, and it was all set out on psychoprofile index cards. Thus, architects could see if their judgment improved over time and to see whether they could accelerate their response times. In practice, architects were supposed to go out onto the streets and collect visual impressions, and in the Laboratory for Psychotechnology of Architecture that was set up in 1926 with these apparatuses was supposed to improve all of this, and then it was going to be created into a spatial model and later into a building. The impacts of architecture were thus simulated in design. The forms that emerged, such as the platform of Lubyanka Metro, were supposed to develop a kind of suction effect and pull passengers in without the use of language. They would be motivating through visual perception as soon as you enter the underground. The result was not supposed to be an explanation telling people how to go using signs, etc., with writing on them, but rather it was supposed to be as automatic and dynamic a movement as possible so that you didn't have to think about things. You just knew how to go unconsciously faster from A to B. You're also not supposed to notice, for example, the connections in the photomontages of Alexander Rodchenko. Various different images combined impossible things, connections between events that happened either simultaneously or completely separately, and this wasn't always visible. Here's an example that dynamically depicts the production of light bulbs from the development to the production to their mass distribution. And the text explains that production has increased tenfold in 5 years. He basically condenses various different processes in one collage, in one image, so that a development that's taken place over years can be seen at a glance. A slow process becomes a dynamic day, and it was called a facto montage. That's what they call it now, the montage of facts. We're used to this sort of construction in today's world. These images here are particularly precarious. They emerged during the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal in the early 30s. Rodchenko basically designed an entire magazine edition of the USSR Under Construction propaganda magazine with lots of images of the progress being made on this canal, which employed 170,000 prison inmates, many who were engineers, who were only imprisoned for the construction of the canal and were released as soon as it was completed. Nearly 50,000 people died in the process, but none of this is seen in any of the images. Instead, they construct a sort of frenzy of labor that lasted 2 years, but all suggest it was done on a beautiful spring day, or even in one spring, was completed in one spring. And the collage shows individual situations by zooming in on them, by turning the workers into heroes, as it were, and the horrible side of the construction, the accidents and the problems were just ignored. This type of collage was very much the fashion in the 20s. You could say even more than film, these collages were, photomontages or photocollages were the dominant genre of visual narrative. If you think about the fact that between 1925 and 1930, some 3,000 posters and countless magazines used these photo collages. In a sense, they fit to socialist Russia as they were able to accelerate time processes, just as the 5-year plans which had begun at the end of the 20s and were part of the party program. And at the same time, they epitomized the idea of the unity of the unequal, all classes and ethnic groups brought together, and all asynchronicities in one image. Just like the images of man of, for example, the French Homme Nouveau or Nietzsche's Übermensch, Homo Sovieticus had absolute faith in the ability to optimize human beings. But one thing was new. Instead of educating people into better people, they were to educate themselves. Ladovsky's targets, the passengers in Moscow, could train and improve their motion from A to B. And the workers at the White Sea Canal that were photographed by Rodchenko, if they survived, were supposed to temper or purify themselves by performing so well and then being released into freedom again. Both projects had the idea behind it that human behavior could be tested in a laboratory and then transferred to social space. Thus, for example, physiologist Ivan Pavlov, the first Russian to get a Nobel Prize in 1904, was an example of this. He had worked on conditioned reflexes, which, unlike innate reflexes, could be learned and trained no matter what somebody's background was. You can see here an image from a documentary film of the avant-garde filmmaker Vsevolod Pudovkin. This was his first feature film. It was shown in 1926 and was trying to communicate classical conditioning theory to the masses. So this famous Pavlov's dog responded to a certain sound linked to feeding by secreting saliva. And if this was repeated often enough, the dog started secreting saliva without even seeing food. And his respondent conditioning behavior was faster and faster, but the dog was particularly responding directly without thinking. And once this behavior had been trained with the help of signals, he could respond to it anywhere. At the same time, the film maintained that children could learn to eat, to wash, and to do tasks they didn't like quite so much, such as washing dishes, this way. Through constant repetition and training, you should be able to turn roughly hewn nature boys into cultivated socialists. And more than this, these socialists emerged automatically through Pavlovian conditioning. And Pudovkin's film was supposed to communicate this message across the globe to the cinema so that every farmer could raise their children better through Pavlovian conditioning. Apart from the children, the men were also exposed to the desire to improve. I'm going to leave the women out of it. I was going to talk to you about the women, but I'll just leave them out, shall I? Because there's not enough time reasons. I know that's a bit casual of me. But the most generously funded project of this was Alexei Gastiev's ZIT, the Central Institute of Labor in Moscow. Gastiev wasn't just a poet, but also belonged to the NOT, Scientific Labor Organization, whose mandate was decided at a conference in 1921, i.e., I quote, "A necessary basis of scientific organization are the work and findings of psychophysiology, reflexology, occupational hygiene, and fatigue of human beings, because this is the only way that we can do justice to the interests of working people as well as the demands of efficient operation and management." Finally, the energy balance of workers, which is something you had to do justice to, showed the main difference to American Taylorism, and basically meant that all of the companies in the Soviet area tried to use all possible disciplines as components of occupational safety. And this was something that was communicated in the artists in the 20s in Moscow, Petrograd, Kazan, Kharkov, and many other cities at people's commissariats, institutes, universities, and academies. Individual centers and entire laboratories were set up focused on the scientific research of labor. And the aim was to be involved in creating factories and streets and all the rest of it. The reasons for this upswing in work science is obvious. The aim was to tackle three immense problems: a dilapidated industrial base, a mass of unqualified, mostly illiterate workers, and a paradox policy of reconciliation of corporate and social interests, industrialization and socialism. Gastyev developed the concept of the ustanovka, which can mean two things. On the one hand, mounting, installation, or plants, and on the other hand, the attitude that you have in the sense of a subjective take on things, a mindset. In his practice, Gastyev, first of all, analyzed the sequences of work through time and movement studies, and then he broke down each movement of these subjects into minimalist, or the smallest possible unit that you could then train individually and put them together to become more effective. And the result was the cultural attitude of people that also meant their involvement in the formal organization of a working space, as well as the psychological attitude, if you like. This psychology, in his case, was linked to the reconstruction of the musculoskeletal system. And he says that mechanization doesn't just standardize gestures, but also methods of production and everyday thoughts. End of quote. Gastyev's ideas on the scientific labor organization, the NOT, ended up in lots of advertising banners in the 20s to convince workers that they shouldn't just be made to do one particular job in a factory, but should be able to be trained to do every single one. In an art exhibition at the Institute of Artistic Culture in St. Petersburg, headed by Kazimir Malevich, there was an exhibition of this, and these abstract artworks were seen as a sort of new shaping of the area of art. Within the framework of all of these transformations from old man to new man, Soviet eugenics was not omitted to fulfill the statements made by Leo Trotsky, a previous companion of Lenin and later Minister of War. He says, "Man will finally be able to harmonize himself. He will make it the job to ensure that the movement of his own organs, whether working, walking, playing, have clarity, expediency, economy, and beauty. He will feel the will in a sort of semi-conscious and later unconscious process in his own organism. Respiration, the cardiovascular system, digestion, and reproduction will be things he will want to master. Life, the purely physiological side of it, will become a collective experimental aspect. Humanity will be radically changed and become an object of the most complicated methods of artificial selection and physiological training." The geneticist, Alexander Sobrovsky, planned a database to capture the genome of the proletariat. He called it Genofund. Through population genetics, he was going to try and find out the economically significant genes in the population, their frequency, the way they were spread, in order to put material together to select the ideal reproductive partner. What seemed most important to him here were the higher levels of human creativity, the artistic, scholarly, and scientific activities. They had to be collected across the globe in order to research their processes and their genetic bases. So what this meant in real terms was, quote, that the everyday political measures of the Commissariat for Health, Education, Work, Security and Law should have a direct influence on the fate of human genes. And therefore, in creating the country, he worked together with Hermann Müller, another American geneticist. So it wasn't just in Russia that this was happening, but it was across the globe. From 1928, Serbrowski led the Medico-Biological Institute, where he was trying to reduce epilepsy. He collected up family trees in which a genetic register was put together, and outpatient clinics, maternity advice centers, and registrar offices were all supposed to be involved, offering advice for families with epilepsy in terms of about getting married or pregnancy, calculating the risk of epilepsy in pregnancies, arranging abortions and sterilization. But eugenics also meant researching congenital diseases, including determining modern civilization diseases. And this is why biologists work together with physicians and psychologists in order to carry out an amnesis of all of their patients. So the aim was to sort of prevent diseases also such as diabetes and others like this. Serbrowski's long-term goal was to use eugenetic interventions to ensure the productivity of the population so that the, and I quote, 5-year plans could be fulfilled in half that time in the future. This program was the logical extension of the work sciences in the way Gastiev ran them, and was also aimed at the rationalization and increasing performance of Soviet industry, not just the way people worked and their everyday that was very much controlled by propaganda. Reproduction of people should also be controlled, and through artificial insemination even be standardized. Traditional ways of living together were dissolved, and bourgeois family structure should be destroyed and women should be liberated, said Serbrowski. But these plans didn't actually end up happening because the politically motivated criticism of biologization of social issues saw society move away from genetics and away from the experimental avant-garde, the women's movement, and the work sciences. But this only took place, this aversion, on an ideological level. On a practical level, the process of assembly and training, condensing time and manipulating perception continued. And thus, new man that was supposed to emerge from this process continued. But what does all of this have to do with us today? I decided to talk about the Russian avant-garde because I think that the manipulation of its recipients has a prominent narrative that says today is the phantasm of growth is our greatest problem. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. In this phantasm, our economy continues to grow, but ignores the scarcity of resources and the fact that we don't live forever. Our faith in endless growth derives from exactly this sort of thought and mindset in which experiments of this kind took place. The competition between socialism and capitalism was one that was measured on growth figures. But how can we explain that the early socialists, instead of focusing on growth, carried out artistic experiments? It's my assumption that the early socialists were more interested in a change of self-perception than in accelerating work processes and growth. And this is why it is important to look at these artistic experiments and compare them to the psychological sides of things. The artists in their everyday lives did try to actually manipulate people in this way. And this changing self-perception is something that we still deal with in today's world. If we work, for example, on creating our personality, achieving something, unfolding our potential, making something out of ourselves. Just that the role of the artist is one that we now play. We are no longer exposed to experiments. We experiment on ourselves. And I've been lecturing in the area of sociology and talking about a phenomenon that we see in the present day. We no longer have a static image of self. We have a flexible one. We seem to be forming ourselves, shaping our lives so that we can live longer and longer. But what does this mean in today's world if we say to make something out of yourself? It is not just the capacity to work efficiently, to contribute to the growth of your family or your company. Today, it means self-actualization, being creative, unfolding your potential. Andrea Fritz talked about the unavoidability of the creative. Our current contemporary culture is defined by the wish to be creative. The creative class are really important with their ideas and the production of symbols, from software development to advertising, from design to consulting and to tourism. And in recent decades, creativity has become a demand of the working world that demands nothing more that we constantly produce new change, new ideas. And we heard about this yesterday as well. And this permanent creativity as a mindset makes it possible for us to deal with phenomena such as the demand that we grow all the time and the disaster of the environment and many other things as well. We still think we can change things. It's just a matter of being creative enough. It's just a matter of how. And this attitude, and I will wrap up now, is everything but new if you think about the creativity euphoria of Russian avant-garde. If creatives were in the periphery before this, in the Russian avant-garde, in this time, for the first time, they were part of establishment and supported, as we do today, the system that they belong to. The question is just how long this will go well. Thank you very much. I apologize that I didn't have the last few pages of that speech, says the interpreter.